Today we're going to be showing you how to inspect and adjust or remove and replace the bottom bracket on your Le Mans Revmaster. To begin, you're going to use a 4mm Allen wrench to remove the drive belt cover screws. There are 4. There are 2 screws left in the back. We will remove them using a Phillips screwdriver. Once you have both Phillips removed, you can position the crank arm as shown in the video at this point and slide the belt cover to the rear of the machine and off of the unit. Before removing the drive belt, lock the brake assembly and release the torque on the crank bolts using an 8mm Allen wrench. Break both sides loose. Using a 7/8 wrench, loosen the idler, and now loosen the tension screw using a 4mm Allen wrench. Loosen the tension screw fully, but do not remove it from the frame. The next step is to remove the drive belt. To aid in this process, you can use a bungee to slide in behind the belt at the top, as shown here. Then slide the bungee all the way toward the tensioner and pull away from the bike while spinning the crank arms. Remove the crank bolts from the unit. To do this, you will need an 8mm Allen wrench or Allen socket. Removal of the crank bolt on the left side of the bike is the same as removal of the crank bolt on the right. The next step is to remove the crank arms. To remove the crank arms, you will need a crank puller tool. To use this, you will simply thread the outer portion into the crank arm as shown here. Be sure that you thread this portion into the crank arm as far as possible. If you do not thread it in far enough, when you start to apply pressure, you will pull the threads out of the crank arm. The assistance of a 7/8 inch wrench could be handy to make sure you've bottomed out that outer portion. Once you have, spin the back portion of the tool into the crank arm. As you do this, you are basically going to press the crank arm off of the axle. Be careful when the crank arm starts to move, as once it comes loose, it will fall off on the floor if you're not holding it. It's also a good idea to go ahead and break loose the outer portion of the tool once the crank arm is loose so you can spin it freely with your hand. Repeat the process for the left side. Don't forget to loosen the outer portion with the tool before removing the crank arm completely from the unit. The next step in the inspection process is to make sure that neither one of the cups is loose. To do this, you will want to use the bottom bracket tool. Place it inside the splines on the cup and just try to turn it by hand either direction. Repeat this process for both sides of the bike. To further verify the adjustment of your bottom bracket assembly, using a rubber mallet, tap lightly on both ends of the spindle to make sure there's not any free play from side to side. If you are just inspecting the bottom bracket for looseness and you do not find any at this point, you would go ahead and reassemble the bike. Once the crank arms are removed and you've made sure that both bearing cups are tight inside the frame, to further inspect your bottom bracket, you would look at the spindle and make sure that it has a good clean edge all the way around for the crank arm to sit on. As you can tell by this picture, our spindle is in quite poor shape, so we are going to replace it today. The next step in that process would be to remove the lock ring. The lock ring is around the bottom bracket cup on the left side of the unit. This is what a lock ring tool looks like. To use it, you simply slip it over the lock ring using the 3 notches and then torque the lock ring in the proper direction. This one is threaded normally, so you would turn it counterclockwise to loosen it. And then you should be able to remove the lock ring by hand just by spinning it off of that bearing cup. The next step is to use the bottom bracket tool to remove the cups from the bike. To use the bottom bracket tool, slide it into the splines and loosen. Sometimes bottom brackets will be seized into the frame. we have found it quite useful to use a couple of additional tools. What you're going to need is a 1 1/4 inch wrench and then a bolt and some washers. Slide the BBT onto the machine and thread the bolt into the axle. You want to get it snug, but you don't want it too tight because you want to be able to loosen the BBT and spin it. Slide the 1 1/4 inch wrench over the bottom bracket tool and use it to turn the cup counterclockwise. This is for the left side of the bike only, as the right side will be reverse threaded. Once the cup is loose, you will then just remove the bolt and washers from the bottom bracket tool. Then continue the process with the bottom bracket tool and a socket wrench or breakover bar, as we're using in this case. And then use a 1 1/4 inch wrench to loosen the bearing cup. Once again, you will need to turn the bearing cup clockwise to remove it from the unit. Sometimes we have found that even this process is almost impossible. To aid in this process, you can set the bike over on its side to get better leverage. You will need to turn that bearing cup clockwise to remove it from the frame. This completes the removal of the bottom bracket on the Le Mans Revmaster.